Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Niamh Gallagher. I'm head of event content here at EGR. Welcome to this EGR webinar in association with Onfido. Today we'll be discussing optimizing your approach to new age verification rules. Before I hand over to our moderator who'll give you more detail on this topic, just a few quick housekeeping notes. So we'll be sending through a recording on the slide deck after the webinar and details of how you can get in touch with the panelists. We also will have time at the end of the panel for Q&A, so you can submit questions through the chat box there. So without further delay, I'll hand over to our moderator, Peter Murray, Head of Gaming at Alexion Services, to introduce our panel.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome from a rather overcast London. I hope everything's good wherever you might be today. We're here to look at the issue of the changes in the LCCP from the UK Gambling Commission on a webinar entitled On the Front Foot. So basically how optimising your approach to new age verification rules, how it's going to work. We will be covering a number of topics. I'll get the panellists to introduce themselves in a second, but clearly this is a key issue for the industry. It's May the 7th, it's a week today, folks, so the UK Gambling Commission is implementing changes to the LCCP. They are significant and they do affect everybody with a UK licence. However, I see it as even more significant than that, because what the Commission does in the UK is clearly viewed by all regulators globally. It's important for UK focus, but when you take into consideration what other jurisdictions are doing, especially around player protection and harm minimisation, it's fair to say that the UK can be seen as a blueprint from a regulatory roadmap perspective and has to be heeded by us all, no matter where you onboard your customers from. Now, there have been a number of discussions and webinars and publications around the changes that are coming. So our aim is not to duplicate those, but to add to the conversation. So while we will cover the principles, as a panel, we'll look at all the practicalities and the challenges around implementing them. We've sought to bring together a panel that gives a range of views. So we've got one of the largest brands in the space making the news both in what they do and how they're trying to get on the front foot, especially when it comes to safer gambling, and that's GVC. We have one of the bespoke tech providers offering both a successful platform and a popular mobile casino product in small screen casinos. And one of the service providers looking to address the issues brought about by the changing face of identity and regulation by disrupting the market, and that's Onfido. But we, as Niamh said, we are also actively seeking feedback and engagement, so please contribute by asking questions and getting in touch either now whilst the webinar is in process or afterwards. And as a panel, we'll commit to responding and giving you an open and honest answer as possible. Bit news to the participants that we're committing to getting back to everybody, but I'm happy to take that on board. So before we delve into the substance of the debate, let me go to the panel first to introduce themselves and give us an idea of who they are, who they work for, and what their roles involve. And I'll start with our man who happens to be out in India, which is Andy Preston. Andy, just give us a minute or so on yourself and what you do, please.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. My name's Andy Preston. I work for GVC Holdings. So some of our main brands in the UK are Ladbrokes, Coral, Gala Bingo. We also have international brands such as bwin. So what I do, I'm responsible for delivering any compliance regulatory change initiatives across the group, primarily focused on the UK. In the past, that's been the changes to the remote technical standards, which were published April 2018, and also the CMA undertakings, which a lot of operators will be familiar with in the UK, which was a piece of work to make marketing more transparent. So as Peter said, I'm in India at the moment. We have a large software presence out here in India, so I'm here working with the teams for the next couple of weeks. Yeah, and that's me, so I'll hand over to Taj.
Good stuff, thanks Andy.
Hi, my name is Taj Ratta. I'm co-founder of Small Screen Casinos. We're a bespoke online casino, mobile-first platform doing B2B and B2C, licensed through Alderney and then latterly into the UK and now going to some other territories. My responsibilities really cover everything, so from marketing, compliance, accounting, whatever it might be, but we cover all aspects.
Good stuff, thanks for that, Taj. James.
Good afternoon. My name is James Hiller. I'm one of the business development leads at Onfido, looking after the financial services and gaming space. So my focus really is to work with those businesses around the UK and perhaps in Europe who are regulated, who require services to complete KYC checks. And for the purpose of today, I'll be talking about how Onfido helps the gaming market.
Good stuff, thanks, James. And for anybody who wishes to know who I am, I head up a consultancy based here in the EU called Lexham Services, and we offer advice on mainly around identity and regulation, around protection and customer engagement. But for the purposes of today, I'm basically moderating the panel, just making sure the conversation flows on and that we're addressing any of the questions that come in. So what I did want to do before we dive into the detail is just give an overview of where we are and how we got to the position we're in today, especially in the UK. And for me, that sits basically around identity, which is where my area of expertise comes in. And it's understanding what was traditional before and how that's changing for the consumers now. So for me, there's two sources. There's traditional KYC, the sort of the data and solutions we've used over 10, 15 years for now, which seemingly supported the industry, and that's simple: name, address, date of birth, stuff we've all used, whether it's yourselves or your suppliers, attributed data that you'll get from government sources or open source data. And what they've been is static and in many ways limited, but they've done a decent job for the industry over the years. However, that's all changing. And I think where we're heading to now is more around understanding the identity of an individual. So yes, that's taking all the data sources we've used previously, but then opening up that to the digital marketplace. So whether that be digital data or maybe the areas that James got expertise in around the biometrics, then we're opening that up into the behavioral analytics. And ultimately, these are around being dynamic and evolving in real time, because that's the bit I think where we need to understand. It's far more dynamic and relevant to the consumer. They're changing in the industry, and identity generally needs to change with it. And we need to tailor those in an open and honest and transparent way. And ultimately, we've sort of had this coming. I hope this realistically isn't a shock to anybody, because the four statements that have come from the UK Gambling Commission over the last 18 months. And they centre on using better quality data, which is the quote you've got there. Actively cooperate with each other, and collaboration is a big issue we'll discuss as we go through, and accelerating that process. We're looking at innovation of products and services and protecting and empowering the consumer because they're at the heart of everything we do. And the licensees are meant to look at their supply chains, suppliers that say I was involved with in the past, and how are they making a greater use of data and technology to help player protection and harm minimization. So these things have been coming, and they've ultimately led to what's coming in next Tuesday on the 7th. And there's four main parts to what the LCCP changes are. So firstly, as you'll see on the screen, it's to verify as a minimum the name, address, date of birth. Now, a number of these we've clearly had before, and we'll come to that in a second. We're not going to prevent withdrawing funds from the accounts without reasonable form of doing so. We inform customers of what types of identity documents or other information that's needed and under what circumstances those will be required. And take reasonable steps. One of the more interesting bits is reasonable steps to ensure that the information they hold on customer identity remains accurate. So they're the main four, and what I'm now going to do is dive into a bit of detail with the panelists around each one of those. So let's start with the two big operators here, so Andy and Taj, and we'll start with Andy first. Do you want to give us your views on the changes, what's coming in, and where you think they place, just what you did previously and how that's impacted you as a business?
Yeah, sure. So previously we had the concept of an active grace period, which meant that we could trigger these checks at any point in the customer journey lifecycle up to the point of withdrawal, and then customers had 72 hours to come back and meet the requirements of those checks. So naturally, a lot of operators did exactly what I've described and put those controls at the point of withdrawal. So I think from a customer perspective, it's not a great experience when you're engaging with an operator they're happy to take your money, but as soon as you try and take your money out, there's these barriers put in place. So I think it is the right thing to do from a consumer perspective to put these checks as a barrier before customers can deposit, bet, etc. I think there's a question over whether it needs to take place at registration. The provision doesn't specify it does. We made a decision to include it as part of the registration process, just because it makes it a lot easier to manage that customer post-registration. If you know they are verified, you can legitimately market to them. I think if there's issues with the data further along that journey, so for example, if you're capturing the sort of, if you're doing the verification checks at a later stage, then it potentially compromises your sign-up data, depending on if you're using third parties to go out to the credit checking agencies. So that's why we chose to do it at registration. It is particularly complex for us because we have a retail footprint, so we have physical shops in the UK that customers can walk into, as well as the online offerings. So there was a lot of work there to try and untangle what we call multi-channel, which is a customer who has an account which they can use in a shop and also online. But I think on the whole, it's a good thing. I'm expecting more changes like this, especially around AML and affordability. And I think, to be honest, this is probably the first step in terms of the data clear up that we can expect to see over the coming months and years.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think one of the key phrases is, back to your point as to when it's done, is the phrase before they can gamble, and what exactly that means. But Taj, from your perspective, what's your thoughts on the introduction of this?
Yeah, I think it's also a great thing. Ultimately, it's a great leveler for all the operators in the industry. Everybody has to do the same thing to get the information on their customer. The downside, I think, is that doing it immediately doesn't give you any flexibility to adopt technologies like Onfido, for example, where you could use document uploads to scrape data and then pre-populate forms. Any sort of time lag in the user journey creates friction, and we all know that people just abandon. So I think the downside is that we have to take a step back to much more of a sort of form-filling exercise in order to onboard customers. We've sort of taken the view that we'll look at the entire registration process and whether you split it into one page or multiple pages. But certainly around the messaging that we put on each of the boxes or the data input fields to try and encourage customers to put data in a manner that will enhance or speed up the validation because it will match against criteria that we're checking against. So it's been a useful exercise in that sense, and I think also it's a great leveler, as I said, because everybody has to kind of do the same thing. I agree that it's a rubbish experience if you you're happy to take money and then you get to a point of withdrawal and you can't withdraw your funds. Yeah. And so what we've done is on our system put a tile on the dashboard, so as soon as you come in, if we managed to age verify you in the past, then great. But if we hadn't and there were some deficiencies, there would be a reminder there constantly for you to upscale the information that you need, and obviously withdrawals were blocked at that point. It'll be interesting to see how it is implemented across the industry, and whether your interpretation of before you gamble. We've taken the view that we would ask for the information all up front and age verify the person, and if we can't, then we won't really allow them into the site, because it's a bit of a rubbish experience if you come in and look around but everything that you click on then says to you, oh, you need to send us more information. That might be more frustrating. So we've sort of kept it as, okay, well, we haven't managed to validate you, here's some information you need to email through if you don't pass immediately. And it will vary, obviously, depending on age group. Whether you're younger, you'll have less points of reference, and older, you'll have more points of reference. But that's what we've done at this point.
No, great. And I think if you look at the text on the screen, a lot of this is we've done before. I think from James, from your perspective, looking at sort of disrupting that supplier base, what's your thoughts on overall what they're asking for and when they're asking for it?
So I think from Onfido's perspective, what we kind of viewed these changes in the regulation as an opportunity for the operators to behave in a slightly different way. So I think both to Andy's and Taj's point, you're right, there are pros and cons to both, and I think the conversations we've been having have kind of sort of led us to believe that actually there's a real opportunity here for operators to do the right thing straight away, to get the information they need straight away, to ensure that they're protecting customers who perhaps have they're vulnerable perhaps, but to ensure that there aren't people signing up for accounts who are underage, who perhaps could have been before. And I think if you look at sort of in particular sort of sports betting, I use that sort of as the lead. You know, any kid who's looking at football the weekend is shown adverts, is encouraged, to look at betting. I think there's an opportunity where people who perhaps shouldn't be accessing sites have been. So I think from Onfido's perspective, we kind of think that there's an opportunity here for gaming operators who are typically, from a technology perspective, very forward-thinking, proactive, to use the regulation change to their benefit, ensure they're protecting customers, and actually provide a really great experience, so that actually if people win, they want to withdraw funds, that actually there isn't that kind of negative feeling of, well, hold on, they took my money, they allowed me to get to bet, but actually upon withdrawal, suddenly they're asking all these questions, and make it feel as though the operator perhaps is less inclined to pay when the person has actually won.
Yeah, I think communication is a key issue that we'll come to in a second. But whether it's a Daily Mail headline or whatever, I think there's some examples of us shooting ourselves in the foot. I think we all agree it's the right thing to do. I think the challenges come on implementing and where you do it. Back to Taj's point there. Andy, come to you first. What's been the biggest challenges on implementing it on somebody sort of your size and with the biggest footprint as you've got?
And the challenges across all the touch points, unfortunately, our front-end technologies aren't as consolidated as they could be. So with multiple brands on different tech stacks, there's challenges there, looking at the sort of mobile and desktop journeys and the client applications to actually just coordinate the work. And the timeline was pretty aggressive, to be honest. So it was pretty much 3 months from the date of the announcement on the 7th of February that all operators were expected to fall in line. So I think that we'd usually get more time and more notice to prepare and schedule things. So I'd say that was the biggest challenge, just doing the coordination work and making sure we obviously want to go in there with a good customer experience. So it's obviously challenging to get the sort of user experience, customer experience teams brought in, perhaps dropping other work they had on the roadmaps to specifically pick this up. But again, I mean, I think it's good to be challenged by the regulators. I think it's good that they had to set hard deadlines and everyone's going to be doing the same thing on the same date. So yeah, I think it was challenging, but I think probably needed to happen.
I agree with that. I also agree with the word aggressive on the timelines, because I think it certainly was. Taj, from your perspective, the biggest challenges you've had?
I think the biggest challenges are, as you say, when a consultation comes out, we've sort of learned that it's probably definitely going to happen.
Yeah.
So we've taken the consultation documents as a starting point, really, for thinking about how we revamp our processes, and whether it's sort of redrawing registration flows and looking at the information, and then also looking at all the other areas that touch that registration piece and other enhancements that we can make. So as a smaller team, it's less cumbersome than perhaps Andy's experience, because we're just dealing with online, be it mobile or desktop. But the challenge is still there to upscale the information you get from the customer, because you really only have one shot. So what you might actually see as a longer term effect is less churn with players, because if they've managed to pass and verify with a provider, they will be less inclined to try and sign up with other providers. But so that's a challenge, but reinventing the entire flow and making the user journey still as seamless as possible, while still triggering the checks in the background to onboard the customer as fast as possible, has been a challenge, and will continue to be a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Andy, just come back to that point about the difference between sort of your retail base and obviously your online. Is it a huge difference between the two when it comes to this?
The main challenge is the regs. So I mean, for retail customers in a shop betting over the counter, there's obviously not the same requirement to be verified. The retail environment has their own verification processes and their own way of checking someone's age in a shop. I mean, you can use facial recognition. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do that you can't do online. So the challenge we've had is almost severing the digital wallet from the retail wallet and just having almost two separate verification processes running.
Yeah, I think sort of James, from your perspective and the technology and data you use, there must be a big difference between the land-based and the online.
Yeah, well, I think so. You know, we obviously work with operators who have both, and I think there is that sort of disconnect. So from, you know, I think from the online perspective, there's many more ways, and it's much more possible to really identify who your customers are, as opposed to someone walking in, you know, off of the high street, as it were. And as a result, I think actually operators can be kind of more confident that the customers they're working with online are truly who they say are, as opposed to people who can just walk in from a retail perspective.
Yeah, I think as I say, a lot of this is sort of, we know it was coming back to Taj's point. It's whether everybody's ready and all the different challenges as everybody's had on there.
The main challenge is still getting people to enter their information. I mean,
absolutely.
in a correct way without spelling mistakes. You know, that's the difficulty that we rely upon. That we face with from an online perspective, that you can cope with when you're doing an over-the-counter transaction, say at a local shop. You've got the ability to get your staff member to perhaps onboard the customer and minimise the evidence of mistakes. But when you're dealing with online, you have to get it right.
Yeah, do you see the sort of document first approach? Because traditionally we've come at this from sort of 10, 15 years of you simply input your data, you know, via your laptop or your phone, which takes into account all the mistakes people can make. Do you see the value of, down the line, of it's as simple as a driving license, it's a document first approach?
So I think they're great technologies, but as I said, because the requirement now is to verify before you gamble, we almost have to sort of strip it back and say, well, fill in your details, we'll match whatever we can, and then upscale the information. If you have to wait for a period of time between taking the photo, that document being processed electronically, and the verification checks happening, even if it's 15 seconds or something, or you know, or even quicker, people just click off and think, oh, it's not working, or I'm not prepared to wait. So definitely a place for using document capture tools, and we in fact do use Onfido for such processes. But it's just where you insert that now in the customer journey, and more so, we will probably do that after we've got a KYC check and use it to upscale information.
And I see just that, my personal view on that is as technology moves on and other marketplaces, you take lessons from that, then it will become more of a biometrics approach and facial recognition and stuff like that. Just quickly, James, you deal with other marketplaces like FS, what's the lessons that the sector can learn from that?
I think what's really obvious is that, you know, 10, 15 years ago, everyone who opened up a bank account did so by walking down to their high street, walking into a branch, and physically sitting down and providing documentation to open up their accounts. If you ask an 18-year-old to do that today, they'll tell you where to go. It's not something people are going to be familiar with or comfortable doing. And so what we kind of see is that actually there's been a huge sort of shift in financial services, where the challenger banks of the world, who saw an opportunity to attract younger customers who want access to an account quickly and easily, typically through an app that sits on their phone, saw an opportunity to onboard customers using technology without the need for a physical premises, and to do so using those kind of document and facial biometric technologies, and they've gained huge market share. And what we're seeing now is some of the larger, more well-known high street banks, building societies are trying to play catch up, because they realise they're losing that share. They haven't had the numbers of 18, 19, 20-year-olds starting their first job, putting their salaries through those traditional banks, opening accounts, and so actually now they're trying to play catch up. But the market's shifting, and I think what's really interesting is that actually financial services, which is typically quite slow to react, has actually had to do this because there's a real requirement to. And where there's an opportunity with gaming is that, although perhaps betting and gaming is quite a personal thing, actually so is who you bank with, so is who you provide your income details to. And so there's a real opportunity here for gaming to sort of catch up with that kind of shift, and to sort of the same kind of customers who are used to those experiences with financial services will then be much more familiar with them when trying to bet or to game online as well.
Yeah. I think there's customer experience is changing everything, and the way people are looking at it. I think your point's valid. people tend to have 4 or 5 maybe gambling accounts rather than 4 or 5 banks, but that is changing as well. I think, Andy, last point on this before we move on to the second part, is there any sort of fundamental changes you've done to your process, whether it be the providers you use or the technology you use to hit the deadline of next week?
I don't think we made any fundamental changes in terms of the technology we use. Obviously, we're doing a lot more. So all our existing customer database, active customers, where we haven't got comfort that we've got a match on the new data points, we're having to reprocess all those. So that's obviously a big piece of work. I think one thing to call out on this one is obviously we've got a national online self-exclusion scheme in the UK, and I think this complements that scheme really well, because previously, customers have been able to register with that scheme, register with us with slightly different details, and then we've had issues with customers who had intended to self-exclude from all operators being able to sort of find a path in somewhere, and I think this sort of closes that loop. So I think it's a sensible thing to do from a consumer protection perspective.
I think that's a great point, and I think the self-exclusion project in itself was always going to have be a challenge for all of us. But I think that area of identity and truly knowing who that person is, and then matching that with the data and the formats from 250, 300 operators was always going to leave gaps open. Recognise that, and hopefully that's the bit that's being addressed. But no, great point. I think. Okay, we'll move on to the second sort of point, which is around not prevent a customer withdrawing funds from their accounts due to a requirement for additional information if you could have reasonably requested that before. So we've probably touched on a couple of points on that. We can look at the practical examples of what we've used and maybe what we've implemented. So it might be quite a brief coverage of this, but I guess a lot of this is around communication. I'll come to you first, Taj, around, and I don't expect you to say communication is not important, but give us some examples of things you might have done around how you're communicating with customers in light of this.
So, as I said, our process has been that we'll try and KYC you, and then if there's any sort of deficiencies, we'll upscale that information. Unfortunately, with gambling, as opposed to say banking, which is a more utility function than gambling, which is perceived to be more entertainment based, people are just inherently lazy customers in terms of providing information, and they also question constantly why they need to provide information when it's my money and it's my entertainment. And so it's been a useful tool, I would suggest, to be able to upscale the information that you need from both a regulatory perspective, from AML, proceeds of crime, etc., at a certain point when there is a need for the customer, a utility for the customer to be able to supply that information. So it's yet to be seen how these changes will impact upon that process, but we also have regulatory obligations in order to make sure that we are complying with AML and sort of proceeds of crime. So it will be interesting to see how that works. So we still have the same requirement that we will provide you with information on the dashboard to say, some of the information isn't quite where it needs to be. You need to provide us with additional information. And withdrawals, unfortunately, will still be blocked at that point until that information is provided. But I don't think you could ever get away from that. I think that's a necessary barrier in order for us to meet our regulatory obligations, and as well as to keep the information that we hold on the customer up to date.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, from your perspective, around the communications, any examples of what you've changed? I'm assuming that at this point, are the changes from your end already in place? Anything still to do ahead of next Tuesday?
No, I mean, the changes are in place. I mean, I think communication on this one's quite difficult, because I think what the Gambling Commission's alluding to is AML, so anti-money laundering. So clearly you don't want to send a customer a message to say, we think you might be laundering money through your gambling account, so please can you send us a couple of bills? It's probably not the kind of communication you want to send out. So what we've done is we've created a sort of help file, which just says that in certain circumstances we might require additional information. We haven't gone into the specifics, so I think for the KYC checks it's just one piece of information, such as a driving license, in one database. Yeah. Whereas for the AML checks it's typically two different pieces of information in two different databases. So I think the complexity of technically doing those checks is is greater. But I think for a communication perspective, I think it's really important that customers, it is transparent that, in some circumstances we may require additional information. And I think as the affordability checks come in, that this is a sort of precursor to that. So just to explaining to customers that, if you do spend X amount of money, then there will be some form of enhanced due diligence, and that will involve supplying yet more data.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think it's how you phrase the points. I think you're right about the AML approach. Despite that might be a driver, it's what messages we're giving out there, because it's about encouraging them to do that. It's a really competitive marketplace, and I think certainly a company of your side's got that different challenges across a few different revenue streams. James, I guess from your perspective, this is around the type of documents that could be used. Obviously, the obvious ones, I guess, are drive for the UK specifically, around driving license, passports. What other options have we got there? Are they predominantly the main two?
Well, I think what we see as a business is with the UK market, we actually see a huge variety of documents. So although for British nationals, primarily, of course, yes, their driver's licenses and passports, because we've got a huge overseas population living in the United Kingdom, actually we see a variety of documents. So, for other nations, there might be ID cards, there might be residence permits that the person uses to prove their identity, because this document isn't necessarily to prove their address, it's to prove that they are who they say they are in terms of name and date of birth. So we actually see a huge variety of documents, and obviously Onfido can and does verify all of those different documents. But in terms of sort of the customer experience, and I suppose this is more from a kind of a personal point of view, I think that the messaging, just to sort of re-emphasise what everyone said, is really key, because having had experiences of opening up new accounts, it might have been in line with an offer, a bonus if you sign up for a particular account, and then you do win. I think there is sort of a huge amount of that sort of negative feeling when you kind of feel like, well, hold on, you let me open up an account, you let me deposit, and it's only now that I've won that you seem to be asking for these extra pieces of information. And the more apparent and obvious it is to the customer from the offset that they're going to be required to provide that information, the better, because then it will reduce that kind of negative feeling. And obviously from a churn perspective will probably help all the operators, because you're less likely to have someone bet, possibly win, and then choose to sort of close the account and move elsewhere because of that slightly negative experience.
No, I'd certainly agree with that. I think it's back to the point where we all know it's the right thing to do. You've seen examples over the time of effectively industry shooting itself in the foot. Some of it's a complicated process, but some could have quite easily been done up front. And I just think we opened ourselves up to some criticism as we've gone through that. But I think we all think it's one of the points. We all think this is the right idea. It's just getting that in place. So let's go on to the third point, which comes up, which is I think we've probably covered that there with yourself there, James, around the types of identity documents. Is there any other information, Taj, you're asking, whether it be email addresses or whatever, the documents one, that's great, we can take that, we can upload it, we might verify it to an extent. Is there any other information you're looking at taking from people in this process?
Not from a registration or KYC perspective. Yeah. We will take additional information when we get to a customer due diligence point or an enhanced due diligence point, depending on the markers that we've got and how much the customer has spent with us. At that point, we do ask for income information in order to do some affordability checks and also to meet our obligations from an AML perspective.
So you actually ask for some affordability type questions?
Yes, so we ask for payslips and income statements at certain triggers that we put in to kind of preempt the storm that's coming with regards to social responsibility.
And how do you find the response when you ask for that kind of thing?
So it's mixed, it's fair to say, but on the basis that we can't get that quality of information from anywhere else, we incentivize the customer in order to provide that information to us. So if there's a financial cost to us to go and acquire softer sources of information around the value of the player, where they live, and sort of what their jobs are, etc. I personally don't think you can rely on somebody's Facebook profile, because it certainly looks more glamorous than the reality probably is.
Yeah, nobody puts anything bad on there. Yeah.
Correct, and you'll be surprised how many people don't own a home and are renting and maybe sort of in the process of moving. So to get good quality information, it has to come from the customer, and the customer wants to continue to play with you, then they'll provide the information, and as soon as everybody starts to do that a similar sort of approach, and they start to see that pushback from everybody, then it will become commonplace and people won't have a problem with supplying that information.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like open banking when that was sort of new to a couple of years ago, and it could have been the answer to all of it. But it's one of those, is he asking for it, and who's going to open up their details to a gambling company? And that's interesting because it does give you those. I'm just interested in the fact you ask for it, and obviously people are willing to give that. But ultimately, I think you're probably right about, you're at the point where there's only so much you can do without actually fronting up and saying, well, we're going to need this information, and then go back to communication and how you put that across. I think, Andy, from your perspective, is there any commentary to add on to that as to what you use, and interested in around the asking for some form of verification of what you earn? Do you do anything like that at present?
We're looking into it as sort of a preemptive investigation as a result of the forthcoming affordability checks. I think the problem at the moment is, as all operators in the UK, Taj described this well, if a customer hits certain thresholds, then it's usually deposits, then they're going to trigger some sort of enhanced due diligence. So a lot of customers are going to say deposit X thousands of pounds. We're going to ask them for something, then they're just going to close their account, walk away, go to the next operator, get to the trigger, do exactly the same thing. So at the moment, customers can just bounce across operators and sort of stay under the radar, because you can go to however many operators there are, hit the first trigger, and then move on. And you, from an AML perspective, you never really, going above the radar. But I think with these changes, that obviously stops, because customers won't be allowed to just offboard and go to another operator. There should be that traceability that enables all operators to act responsibly.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's touch point. It's leveling the playing field, I think, and the days of simply just moving on from one to another, hopefully that gets rid of that. I think I'm also interested in this from a sort of international perspective, back to what James said earlier around there's certain jurisdictions that have a lot of data that's out there, and whether it be the UK or the US or some of this, but from an international perspective, Andy, just on yours, because yes, this is UK. Is this something you've decided as a brand to roll out across all your license applications, or is this predominantly UK first?
It's UK first. I mean, different markets have different requirements. Spain, for example, everything goes to a sort of central database which processes everything, so all transactions are copied and replicated. In France, they have a similar setup with a sort of secure vault where sort of the data is sent. So I think a lot of the other operators in Europe especially are very keen on data, and also having copies of data, customer data, as soon as possible, because I guess it helps them reconcile sort of tax returns and things like that from the operators. And I think the UK is sort of stepping up and sort of moving in line with that sort of approach. I suspect the US is going to be similar. They've got a very sort of rigorous approach to regulation, so I would expect a similar approach from them, if not even harsher.
No, I'm with you on that, especially the US. I've been through the pain of trying to get a license application in, and 51 pages, and tax returns and spousal returns and etc. It's particularly prescriptive. But you're right. The UK has one of the issues is it does not have a centralized governmental database in that respect. As a country, we've chosen not to go down the route of ID cards, so it makes the identity a bit more complicated, and that's where I think sort of the approach now of whether it be document first or facial recognition or biometrics is going to change the game for the positive, I think. So okay, that's great, thanks for that. I think we'll move on to sort of the last point on there, which is one of the more interesting ones for me personally, which is taking reasonable steps to ensure the information they hold on a customer's identity remains accurate. And the reason that's interesting is because it's probably unclear, what it means, what it does. There was a time, we've all referenced this, where it was simply about onboarding people. Now it's much more about truly knowing who your customer is and keeping information up to date and all the benefits that go with it. So it's the practicalities that we're so used to dealing with, something that's timestamped, that'll verify you at the certain point that you came on. Taj, from your perspective, what's the challenges around keeping something up to date, and what are you looking at to deal with this?
So keeping things up to date, obviously, it's hard enough to get the information off the customer first of all, and then every certain triggers you have to ask them for the information again, or sort of updated documents. Practically speaking, we've taken the approach that if we have a valid form of identification, say driving license, passport, the expiry date on that is valid, and we'll keep that. If we're asking for proof of address, we will adopt what is sort of commonplace, 3 months. If you've got something that's dated within 3 months, then we will accept that to upscale the information that we've got. It really comes in to the customer due diligence and enhanced due diligence steps that I suppose we're really looking to upscale the information. The obvious one is the sort of CDD point in the UK, where it's £1,800 worth of deposits, and you have to kind of perform a review of the customer. If you've already got the information, great. If not, then that's a good sort of starting point. It's not a particularly high point, although I'm not saying £1,800 is a low amount. But there are certain triggers and useful points where we can look to upscale the information. And generally, again, that's why I said earlier that withdrawals could still be blocked at certain points, because one needs to update the information that we hold on the customer to meet the regulatory need. So it won't necessarily be a case of we're doing it because they've won, or they've signed up and got a bonus and deposited a large amount, and we're preventing them. I suppose it comes back to communication. We need to communicate that there is a regulatory need for doing this.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this, we covered it slightly earlier about, how close are we getting to something in real time? I think, Andy, from your perspective, and you mentioned affordability earlier on, which is, that's constantly been the need for that to be updated on a regular basis. How have you approached this, and any practical examples of what you're using to keep things up to date?
Yeah, so we've taken it on the premise that we're only going to do this for active accounts. And we've defined a period for which we consider accounts to be active. So any accounts beyond that range would be just put into a bucket of unverified. So they would in effect be treated as someone who was trying to sign up for the first time. So that's how we've taken it for the 7th of May. On an ongoing basis, we've just applied a cyclical approach, which means that if a customer has data that's valid on the 7th of May, we're assuming that after a certain period of time that data is stale and needs to be revalidated. So we'll just put some on-screen messaging to those customers, asking them to confirm that the data they've supplied is correct. We'll obviously log those responses, and that'll be ticking the box for those customers. And for the others who say that it's changed, then obviously we'd change that and redo the checks. Yeah,
I think affordability is one that sort of interests me, and sort of the background I come from is what's out there and what you can use. I think, and I mentioned open banking earlier, Andy, from your perspective, affordability are you going to traditional sources to try and update that, or what are you using from GBC's perspective?
Yeah, so we're in talks with a number of third-party providers who offer that service, if you like. So I mean, for those of you who aren't that familiar, there's a process whereby you can sort of, as part of a customer journey on an operator's site, you would jump out to the third-party journey, potentially, as with open banking, put your bank details in. There'd be some data then sort of sent to that third party, and they'd then push a score back to the operator to tell the operator that customer had an affordability score of whatever the scale or range was. So I think that the technology is there for that to be done. I think it's still early days, and I think it's still early days in terms of even how you should measure that affordability. Is it over a month? Is it over a year? So I think until those points are cleared up, it's going to be difficult to sort of come to a logical conclusion in terms of what the best solution is. I think that consultation needs to finish and the guidance needs to come out, and then I think that's the point when operators will know what the best thing to do is for them.
No, I equate this sometimes to the payday loan sector. I don't particularly want to be associated with that, but that ability to it's not enough to know I can bet, it's enough to know you need to know. But then that's so judgmental as to what that means, and whether that then comes back to just putting limits on people, or how much time they can be on the site. So it's a particularly difficult one. But I'm with you, Andy. I think that the technology is coming along. We're only a part way into that journey, but I think there's going to be options around that. I think, James, from your perspective, if we're looking at the information they're holding, keeping that accurate, what's your views on what sort of the data and technology can tell us?
Well, I think I think from when someone becomes a customer, clearly you need to make sure that the information you're holding about them is accurate. But in terms of, I suppose, keeping it up to date, we, as a business, Onfido tends not to do too much remediation work with the gaming operators. Financial services, we quite often will be asked to look at people who became customers perhaps 5 years ago, 10 years ago, of a particular fund or account which perhaps the bank was offering. And they might be interested to understand, did we do the right job? Have we actually got up-to-date information held about those customers? In the gaming space, perhaps that's not something we've really entered into previously. But again, I think sort of harking back to sort of the conversation a few moments ago, I think as long as the information is shared and the messaging is correct with the customer, then I don't think in general people have too much of a problem with it, as long as there's a real explanation as to why there's a requirement to update the information, and perhaps get the customer thinking more about their online betting account as they would do their online bank account, where there would be much more up for sort of providing that information, because they realise there's a huge benefit to doing so.
I'll just pick up on that point there, because you're absolutely right. I think one of the key things I think everybody's identified is around collaboration. You might have the best data, the best technology, but no one person, one provider, one company's going to be able to solve this issue, especially when it comes to the whole environment of safer gambling. So from a collaboration point of view, I'll come to you, Andy, on this one. Do you see the changes in that around the sector? Because I think my frustration personally around this is everybody else does it. Everybody else shares data, whether it be the financial services, the insurance market, or whatever. But historically, the gambling sector hasn't, to its detriment, in my opinion. I'm going slightly off the topic here, but from Andy, from your perspective, do you see that changing? Are we a bit more forward thinking when it comes to sharing what we know?
I do. I think, and that sort of sharing has been facilitated by third-party groups such as Senate and the Remote Gambling Association. So there are groups out there who are encouraging operators to work together. The markers of harm research from Senate, for example, would be one piece where operators were asked to come together, share data in terms of how they evaluated at-risk customers. That data was then pooled and then sort of put into a proposal to be a sort of default set of I guess markers and scores for everyone in the industry. So I think it does happen. I think it's not inclusive enough. So it only seems to be some of the sort of heavy hitters who were ever sort of brought into those conversations. And I think different initiatives have a different mix of representatives. So not all operators would be involved in all initiatives, and I think it probably needs a steer from the UKGC to encourage that sort of approach to be set up. I mean, I guess the closest I've seen to that working effectively was GamStop, and they had an operator session a couple of weeks ago in central London. There were literally hundreds of people there representing all different operators in the UK, and that was quite a very collaborative, open session. People talked about problems, talked about solutions, and I think more of those type of sort of open sessions where every operator has a voice are beneficial.
No, I believe so, under Chatham House rules, so I can't ask you what was said on there, but I think it's around for me, it's about trust and sustainability of the sector. We're high profile. No politician's ever going to dive into the trenches, I think one person said, to defend what we are as an industry. And there's other challenges that are out there. And I think personally, the only way is to try and put aside the differences you might have, whether you're a supplier or an operator or indeed a regulator, because they have their responsibilities as well. But I think that collaboration is genuinely the only way sustainability is going to be achieved. I think, Taj, from your perspective, do you see changes in how people are talking to each other and working alongside each other?
Yeah, I mean, to Andy's point, GamStop was a great event because we could all sit down and talk openly about the challenges that we were facing. If there was something similar from UKGC, then perhaps that would encourage a bit more collaboration. I went to an event that they hosted in Birmingham, and I felt it was very much we were all getting told off rather than, but still told to collaborate. But we were just sitting there listening to what we've potentially done wrong and what's coming down upon us. As Andy said also, you know, there are organisations that are trying. It doesn't help when UKGC doesn't turn up to ICE and certain things like that, where it's then difficult to engage with them. However, the market, I suppose, they've looked upon the market and said, well, there are some bad players here, or there are some bad practices and processes, and we need to set in stone certain standards. And to that extent, that's admirable and great. It doesn't mean that there's a lot of collaboration because people are just sort of running around trying to get their houses in order. But GamStop was a great example of how to achieve a collaborative approach and collective thought that will then hopefully feed back into something that we all have to subscribe to. And if UKGC, in my opinion, did something more like that, their consultations do that to a degree, but it's still faceless. You know, it's still sent out to the masses, and you make your comments.
I'll happily pick up on the regulator not attending ICE and their engagement, because I think you see it elsewhere. It's just critical that we're talking about collaboration and regulators talking to regulators, or operators to operators, and suppliers to suppliers. But ultimately, that engagement between the regulator and its license holders is critical. And I genuinely don't know what the thought process is around not coming to events like ICE, and because how else I know we'd had the challenges the year before, but not coming, not engaging, not seeing. You know, I'll go and meet them in Birmingham. You guys will, and present what we do and how we hope to better the industry. But to avoid those things, it is strange, and I personally hope that's something they'll look at, because I think that does need to change. Because you don't see that with, well, I was going to say some of the other regulators, but certainly the ones I've dealt with globally tend to be more engaged with the people.
I think there's a greater degree of standardization that's coming in across the board for all online operators, all offline operators, and so on and so forth. And with that greater standardization of practices, it will eventually force itself to a more collaborative approach, because we all have to operate to a standard, whatever that standard might be, or a rule set, whatever that rule set might be. And therefore it's a question of getting everybody in a room together at that point and saying, okay, how can we either enhance this particular process or procedure or standard to make it work better for the customer but still meet the regulatory requirement?
Yeah. We'll come to questions in a second, but one that jumps out from this perspective, I'll come to you first, Andy, on this one, which is around what used to be the bane of everybody's life. It seems like a lifetime ago, but it's still out there, which is GDPR. So if we are going to share data, I'll be interested, James, also on how other people do it. But from your perspective, Andy, the sharing of data, the sharing of information, how we all pool this together for the better of the sector, do you think GDPR is a blocker, or do you think there's ways around that?
I don't think so. I mean, GDPR is about consent. So as long as we're seeking consent from customers and it's transparent what we're going to do with their data, I don't see there being a big issue there. There's obviously personal information is sensitive. It needs to be encrypted. The right security controls need to be in place. But I think if it's managed properly, I don't see any issues in that data being shared.
Yeah. Same with you, Tash?
Yeah, if there's a need for it, I suspect there'll be more anonymized data that's useful from a collaboration perspective rather than in an individual person's identity. You might have sort of a test case, for example, but there's no need to share whole reams of data with people. It's much more the behavioral and practicalities or collective information that gives you a picture of what's going on.
I think that it's a subject of a whole other webinar around what identity is going to look like in a couple of years' time, whether that's tokenized, federated, self-sovereign, however you call it, but that's fundamentally going to change. And I think what individuals will have is different levels of identity, whereby you might use one to open up a shopping account, one for your gambling, one for your bank, and that will be anonymized to an extent. It will be tokenized. They'll hold the power. So I think we're gradually developing to that. I think back to the GDPR issue, which I think it was the Gambling Commission themselves who said you can't use this as a barrier to to the identification and understanding process. So I think Andy's point is really valid, which is it's found consent. And once you've got that and explained properly up front, we should be able to use it. From your point of view, James, before we get on to questions, you've seen that elsewhere. Around, do you think GDPR is an issue?
I don't. I think that again, providing that the consent is provided by the customer, that actually the way that Onfido operates in terms of being a sort of data processor rather than a data controller means that we can help those operators ensure that the customer's data is managed correctly. And obviously is anonymised and encrypted to ensure that they are protected. And in relation to perhaps some other sort of shareable information, particularly around biometrics, some of the sort of private initiatives we've seen is that, perhaps with things like GamStop, is that actually because customers can use false information, perhaps might be sort of friendly fraud where they're using friends or family members' details to sign up and try and circumnavigate the kind of procedures and safeguards that are in place. Actually, by using biometric data, people's faces, and using them across sort of the different brands within GamStop, is actually a really great opportunity to work collaboratively and ensure that people who need that protection, who have self-excluded, can be, and that information can be shared correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and the couple of minutes we've got left, we've got a couple of questions. If anybody wants to fire out any more, I'll come in no particular order. What about email addresses as part of the KYC data? Are there concerns about whether the email addresses given by players need to be valid and active?
I think that's a communication point. It's a useful touch point to engage with the customer. Again, you're just reliant upon the customer putting in the correct information and yourself using validation tools to do that. It's a tricky thing. The more information you ask for, are you more likely to put people off? It's a valuable tool to communicate with people, for people certainly from an abandonment process. If they get halfway through a form and don't go on to fully KYC, you've then at least got a touch point. Whether it helps with your KYC, I don't think so. It probably just helps your communication.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Absolutely. Is that your view on that, Andy, with regards to email addresses?
Yeah, I mean, as a data point, it's not watertight. I guess the challenge we have at the moment is the National Online Self-Exclusion Scheme asks us to match against email addresses. So until that changes, email addresses will continue to be collected. Obviously, a useful marketing tool. We do monitor bounce rates on sort of marketing emails and service messages sent to email. So we know if an email account's been closed, or so we do sort of track it. But I think for a marketing service message route, it's obviously a valid communication mechanism.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. So finally, we'll come to the last the question on here. We've only got a minute left. So I'll stick with you, Andy, for this. So what are the actions to be taken for existing players who have not sent KYC for verification prior to next Tuesday? What have you guys got in place for that?
Those players will be treated as unverified, so they won't be able to deposit, won't be able to bet. So the account will be locked down for them. They will see some on-screen messages advising them what they need to do. We've tried to incentivize our existing active customer base as best we can to sort of to verify. I think other operators have as well. So I got a free bet offer to validate my own account details with one operator. So I think that's one method that operators have used to try and encourage customers to engage. And the good thing is it's not just one operator that's doing this, it's all operators. So it's not going to help them if they go somewhere else. So to Taj's point earlier, it should reduce churn. So I think you just need to reach out to those customers, and hopefully once they realise they need to do something, and wherever else they go, they need to do the same thing. It should encourage them to do what they need to do.
Yeah, Taj, last point to you on that one.
I completely agree with Andy on that. Actually, yeah.
Good.
I don't have anything else to add. Sorry.
Okay, that's not a problem. That's fine by us, and that's okay. So thanks to everybody who's listened in. Thanks to Taj, Andy, and James, and especially Onfido and EGR for hosting the webinar. Any of the questions that have come through, we'll happily respond to when the recording comes out. But that's it from us. Wish you well wherever you are in the world. Take care and have a good week.
Well.